In a tense corner of New York City, where racial tensions had always simmered beneath the surface, FBI agent Malik Johnson's last moments unfolded with brutal efficiency. The streetlights cast harsh shadows across the scene as two police cruisers pulled up alongside him. Malik stood his ground, knowing his rights and his position, but also acutely aware of the statistics that made every such encounter potentially lethal for a young black man. The officers approached with hands already on their weapons. Malik slowly reached for his FBI credentials, his movements deliberate and calm. "I'm reaching for my identification," he announced clearly, following protocol. But something was wrong. The officers' aggressive stance, their refusal to listen, all pointed to this being more than a routine stop. "Stop moving," one officer shouted, while another circled behind Malik. Despite following every procedure he'd been trained in, Malik found himself slammed against the concrete wall. His FBI credentials clattered to the ground, unnoticed or deliberately ignored. The situation escalated in seconds, a knee on his back, handcuffs too tight, and then the unthinkable. Shots rang out, echoing through the neighborhood. Across town, Clara sat in the FBI's New York field office, reviewing case files when her phone buzzed. The caller ID showed her supervisor's number. Her hand froze over the files as she listened to the news. Malik Johnson, her partner and friend, was dead. Shot during what was officially being called a routine stop. The phone slipped from her fingers, clattering on the desk. Around her, the office continued its normal buzz of activity, unaware that everything had just changed. As night fell, the corner where Malik died transformed into a memorial. Candles flickered against the darkness, their light reflecting off countless photos of Malik, some showing him in his graduation gown, others with his family, all depicting a life cut brutally short. Jamal Watson, an investigative journalist for the New York Tribune, stood among the mourners, his notebook forgotten in his pocket as he watched Malik's mother collapse into the arms of supporters. The vigil grew larger as word spread through social media. Neighbors emerged from their homes, adding their voices to the growing chorus of grief and anger. Jamal observed the scene with growing determination. Something about this death felt different, the way certain officers hung back, the whispered conversations, the speed with which the department issued its statement. His reporter's instincts, honed over years of covering police misconduct, told him there was more to this story. Through the crowd, Jamal caught glimpses of uniformed officers watching from their cruisers. They maintained their distance, but their presence felt like a threat rather than protection. As he interviewed mourners, a pattern emerged in their stories. Malik had become increasingly distant in recent months. He'd missed family gatherings, stopped attending his regular basketball games, and seemed preoccupied with something he couldn't discuss. A young woman who identified herself as Malik's cousin mentioned his recent strange behavior. "He kept saying he was working on something big," she whispered to Jamal. "Something that would change everything. But he never told us what it was." As the vigil continued into the night, Clara arrived, staying at the edges of the crowd. Her FBI badge felt heavy in her pocket. She watched Jamal working the crowd, gathering stories, and felt a mix of hope and fear. Someone needed to uncover the truth, but she knew better than anyone how dangerous that truth might be. The death of Malik Johnson was about to expose something far larger than a single act of police brutality. It would unravel a web of corruption that had been growing unchecked for years. But for now, in the flickering candlelight, a community mourned while the first threads of investigation began to unwind. In the dimly lit evidence room of the FBI field office, Clara sat alone with her laptop, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. On the screen, Malik's face looked back at her through recorded video logs, standard procedure for undercover agents. She pressed play on the most recent file, dated just 3 days before his death. Operation Blue Shield, Day 147, Malik's voice came through clearly. "I've confirmed Officer Reynolds' connection to the drug shipments through the evidence room. But it goes higher. Captain Martinez isn't just covering it up, he's orchestrating it. I'm close to accessing their financial records." Malik paused, rubbing his face tiredly. "If I'm right about this, we're looking at corruption across multiple precincts. They're watching me though. Getting closer. I need more time." Clara's hand shook as she opened file after file. Each video revealed more pieces of the puzzle: names, dates, locations. Malik had methodically documented everything, building an airtight case against a network of corrupt officers. He'd tracked money laundering operations, documented evidence tampering, and uncovered connections to organized crime. The scope was staggering. Meanwhile, across town, Jamal sat in a quiet coffee shop with Marcus, Malik's childhood friend. "He changed about 8 months ago," Marcus explained, stirring his untouched coffee. "Started missing our weekly basketball games, wouldn't answer calls for days. When he did show up, he was different, distracted, always checking over his shoulder." "Did he ever say why?" Jamal pressed, his recorder running discreetly on the table. "Once, after a few beers, he mentioned something about dirty cops. Said he was working on something that would clean up the department. I thought he was just venting, you know. Lots of black cops struggle with what they see on the force." Marcus's voice cracked. "If I'd known, maybe I could have helped, maybe he'd still be." Jamal gathered similar stories throughout the day. Malik's sister described him missing their mother's birthday for the first time ever. His neighbor mentioned strange cars parked outside his apartment at night. His girlfriend spoke of his increasing paranoia, how he'd check for surveillance devices in his home. Each account painted a picture of a man who knew he was in danger but wouldn't back down. Back at the FBI office, Clara faced a critical decision. The evidence Malik had gathered was damning, but releasing it would expose an ongoing federal investigation and potentially compromise other operations. More importantly, it would put a target on the backs of anyone who knew about it. She thought of Malik's family, still planning his funeral, unaware that their son had died trying to expose systemic corruption. She inserted a flash drive into her computer, hands steady now with determination. As she began transferring files, a knock on the door made her jump. Assistant Director Thompson stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Clara, we need to talk about the Johnson case. The department is pushing for a quick resolution. They're saying it was a justified shooting, he allegedly reached for a weapon." Clara's jaw tightened, but she kept her face neutral. "Sir, with respect, that's not what happened. Malik was working on something big. Be careful, Agent," Thompson warned. "Some doors, once opened, can't be closed. Think about your career." After he left, Clara stared at the flash drive, now loaded with evidence that could shake the NYPD to its core. She thought about Malik's last video log, his determination to see this through despite the risks. The decision crystallized, the truth had to come out, whatever the cost. The protests began organically on social media before spilling onto the streets of New York. Within days of Malik's death, thousands gathered in front of NYPD headquarters, their signs demanding justice mixing with chants that echoed through the concrete canyons of Manhattan. Clara watched from her car, her FBI badge feeling like a weight in her jacket pocket as she observed the growing crowd. "Say his name," the protesters called. "Malik Johnson," came the thunderous response. The atmosphere was charged with a mixture of grief and determination. Someone had enlarged Malik's FBI badge photo into a poster, and it now faced the police station, his steady gaze a silent accusation. Officers in riot gear formed a line across the building's entrance, their faces obscured behind reflective visors. Jamal moved through the crowd, his press badge prominent, capturing testimonies on his phone. His first article about Malik's death had gone viral overnight, particularly the details about his FBI status that hadn't been initially disclosed by the police. The story had been picked up by national news outlets, turning what might have been a local tragedy into a nationwide conversation about police accountability. "He was one of their own," Jamal wrote in his follow-up piece, "an FBI agent working to protect and serve, yet his badge offered no protection when he needed it most. What chance do ordinary citizens have?" The article hit like a bombshell. Within hours, protesters from neighboring states began arriving in New York. Social media exploded with hashtags demanding justice for Malik. Videos of his mother speaking at the vigil went viral, her quiet dignity in the face of loss moving millions. Clara sat in her car, watching the scenes unfold. The flash drive in her pocket contained enough evidence to vindicate every protester's anger, but releasing it would mean crossing a line she couldn't uncross. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from her superiors, urging caution, demanding discretion, reminding her of protocols. But Malik's voice from the recordings kept echoing in her mind, "They need to be exposed." The protests gained momentum as community leaders and activists joined the cause. What started as anger over one death expanded into a broader movement against police corruption. Protesters shared stories of evidence disappearing from lockup, of charges being mysteriously dropped for certain suspects, of officers living beyond their means. As night fell, the crowd showed no signs of dispersing. Light from thousands of phones illuminated the gathering, live streams broadcasting the scene worldwide. Clara finally stepped out of her car, her decision made. She removed her FBI badge and tucked it away. Tonight, she wasn't an agent but a citizen seeking justice. She joined the edge of the crowd just as Jamal was addressing a group of protesters. His words carried over the makeshift PA system. "They want us to believe this was a tragic mistake, a simple misunderstanding. But we know better." Malik Johnson was a federal agent investigating police corruption. His death wasn't a mistake, it was a message. "Well, tonight we send our own message, we will not be silenced." The crowd erupted in cheers. Clara clutched the flash drive in her pocket, knowing that its contents would turn these protests into something much larger. As she made her way through the crowd toward Jamal, she noticed several plainclothes officers photographing protesters. She recognized their techniques: surveillance, identification, intimidation. They were building files on the movement's leaders. But something else caught her attention. Certain officers seemed particularly interested in Jamal. They tracked his movements through the crowd with too much focus for it to be casual observation. She remembered Malik's last recordings, his mentions of being watched. The same patterns were repeating. Under the cover of night, Clara met with a group of trusted activists in a basement community center in Brooklyn. The room hummed with nervous energy as she pulled out the flash drive. "What I'm about to show you," she explained, her voice barely above a whisper, "is what Malik died trying to expose." The group huddled around a laptop as she began playing the files. Documents, surveillance footage, and financial records flashed across the screen. The evidence revealed a sophisticated operation, officers staging drug busts only to resell the confiscated narcotics, evidence disappearing from lockup, witness testimonies altered or buried. But most damning were the bank statements showing suspicious deposits to offshore accounts belonging to high-ranking officers. Across town, Jamal's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number: "Loading dock. Pier 17. Tonight at 2 a.m. Bring no one." Normally, he'd ignore such mysterious messages, but the sender added, "M. Johnson." Despite his instincts screaming caution, Jamal found himself driving through the deserted streets of the waterfront district. The source turned out to be a nervous-looking evidence room clerk named Torres. "I can't talk long," he stammered, constantly glancing over his shoulder. "But you need to know, Malik was onto something big. The night before he died, he accessed files about Operation Clean Sweep." "What's Operation Clean Sweep?" Jamal pressed. "Officially, a major anti-drug initiative from 3 years ago. Actually, it was a cover for the biggest evidence theft in NYPD history. Millions in drugs and cash just vanished. But Malik found something else: connections to judges, prosecutors, even some feds." Before Jamal could ask more questions, Torres disappeared into the night, leaving behind a USB drive. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about corrupt cops, but an entire system of law enforcement compromised at multiple levels. Meanwhile, Clara noticed she was being followed. A black SUV had been tailing her for the past hour, maintaining just enough distance to avoid suspicion. She recognized the technique. It was straight out of the FBI surveillance playbook. When she tried to lose them by taking random turns through residential streets, a second vehicle joined the pursuit. Her phone rang, Assistant Director Thompson again. "Clara, we know you have the files. Think carefully about your next move. Some things are bigger than one person's death." "Is that a threat, sir?" Clara kept her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Consider it career advice. The Bureau has a long memory." After hanging up, Clara noticed her phone's GPS was active, though she hadn't turned it on. They were tracking her through her own device. She pulled over, removed the battery from her phone, and bought a burner phone from a corner store. Jamal, reviewing Torres's USB drive in his apartment, began connecting the dots. The corruption went beyond simple theft and drug dealing. There were hints of political protection, systematic witness intimidation, and strategic prosecution of cases to protect certain interests while aggressively pursuing others. A knock at his door made him freeze. Through the peephole, he saw two men in suits, definitely not reporters or activists. As they began picking his lock, Jamal grabbed his laptop and the USB drive, slipping out the fire escape just as his door burst open. The conspiracy was revealing itself, but so were its defenders. Clara and Jamal were now marked targets, just as Malik had been. The question wasn't just about exposing the truth anymore, it was about staying alive long enough to do it. Clara and Jamal finally met face-to-face in an abandoned warehouse converted into a community art space, neutral ground suggested by a mutual contact. Their first interaction was tense, each sizing up the other, both aware that trust could mean the difference between life and death. "I've got evidence of systemic corruption," Clara stated directly, placing her flash drive on a paint-splattered table. "I've got names, dates, and a dead man's trail," Jamal responded, adding his USB drive next to hers. "Plus, about 6 hours ago, someone tried to break into my apartment." They spent the next 3 hours comparing notes, building a comprehensive picture of what they were facing. Clara's FBI background provided context for the financial trails, while Jamal's journalistic connections helped identify key players they hadn't previously linked. The scope of the corruption was far worse than either had imagined. "We need to get this public," Jamal insisted. "All of it?" "Not yet," Clara cautioned. "Release it too soon, and they'll bury it. We need leverage, insurance." They decided to hold a strategic press conference, releasing just enough information to put their opponents on edge without showing their full hand. The event was hastily organized at the New York Press Club, with major networks in attendance. As Clara and Jamal presented their initial findings, they noticed several high-ranking police officials shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The police department's response was swift and aggressive. Within hours, their PR team was discrediting both Clara and Jamal. They painted Clara as a disgruntled FBI agent passed over for promotion, and Jamal as a sensation-seeking journalist with a history of anti-police bias. Social media bots amplified these narratives, flooding comment sections with coordinated attacks. Then came the warning. Clara found it slipped under her door: photos of her meeting with Jamal, surveillance shots of her daily routine, pictures of her sister's house in Connecticut. The message was clear: back off, or others will pay the price. Jamal received his warning differently. His paper's editor called him in. "The department's threatening to pull all our press credentials," the editor explained. "They're also hinting at a libel suit. The paper can't back you on this anymore." But instead of intimidating them, these threats reinforced their resolve. They began working out of a series of temporary locations, never staying in one place too long. A network of supporters, activists, reform-minded officers, and community leaders provided safe houses and secure communication channels. Late one night, as they reviewed evidence in a basement office of a sympathetic church, Clara received an encrypted message from within the FBI: "Watch the money. Operation Clean Sweep connects to Cayman account number 4789. MJ was close." It was signed with a code that only Internal Affairs would know. This goes beyond New York, Clara realized, pulling up financial records. These accounts, they're connected to police departments in 3 other cities. Jamal's journalistic instincts kicked in. It's not just a corruption ring, it's a network. They're using legitimate police operations as cover for a multi-state criminal enterprise. As they worked, they became aware of another troubling pattern: key witnesses were disappearing. The evidence room clerk who had helped Jamal couldn't be found. A patrol officer who had reached out to Clara stopped showing up for work. The web of silence was tightening. They needed to move faster, but they also needed to be smart. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and they'd end up like Malik. The alliance between an FBI agent and a journalist was unprecedented, uncomfortable, but necessary. They were no longer just seeking justice for Malik, they were fighting to expose a system that had turned law enforcement into an organized crime operation. The confrontation came on a rainy night in Queens. Clara and Jamal were leaving a meeting with a potential whistleblower when 3 unmarked police cars boxed them in on a quiet street. 6 officers emerged, none wearing badges or identifying markers. This wasn't an arrest, it was an intimidation tactic. "Agent Foster," one officer called out, using Clara's last name. "Let's talk about those files you've been collecting." His hand rested casually on his weapon. Clara and Jamal stood back to back, surrounded. Through her peripheral vision, Clara noted security cameras on nearby buildings, all conveniently pointed away or covered. This had been planned. "You're interfering with an ongoing federal investigation," another officer said, moving closer. "That's a serious offense." "Funny," Jamal replied, his phone recording secretly in his pocket. "I don't see any federal badges here. Just some cops who forgot their identification." The tension broke when a group of teenagers turned onto the street, phones out and recording. The officers retreated to their vehicles, but their message was clear: they could get to Clara and Jamal whenever they wanted. The incident sparked something unexpected. When Jamal posted the audio recording online, it went viral. Within days, protests spread from New York to Chicago, Los Angeles, and Miami. Each city had its own stories of police corruption, its own Malik Johnsons. What started as a local movement became national news. Clara's FBI contacts confirmed that similar patterns of corruption were emerging in other cities. The same financial structures, the same methods of evidence manipulation, the same intimidation tactics. It wasn't just a coincidence, it was coordinated. Then came the breakthrough. While reviewing Malik's files for the 100th time, Clara noticed something in the background of a surveillance photo, a familiar face at a police charity gala. Agent Thompson, her FBI superior, shaking hands with Captain Martinez, one of the key suspects in the corruption case. He's been blocking the investigation from inside the bureau, Clara realized. Every time Malik got close, Thompson would reassign resources or redirect attention. The movement continued to grow. Protests now regularly drew tens of thousands. Civil rights organizations filed class action lawsuits. Reform-minded politicians began calling for independent investigations. The pressure was building, but so were the risks. One morning, Clara found her car's brake lines cut. That same day, Jamal's source at the evidence room was found unconscious in his apartment, an accidental gas leak. The message was escalating from intimidation to elimination. They needed a safe place to compile their evidence and plan their next move. A local church offered its basement, and supporters organized a security detail. As they worked, more evidence poured in: anonymous tips, internal documents, surveillance footage. People within the system were starting to turn. The corrupt officers didn't sit idle. They launched a coordinated media campaign, painting the protesters as anarchists and the investigation as a witch hunt. Friendly judges signed warrants. Internal affairs investigations were opened against whistleblowers. The machine was fighting back. But Clara and Jamal had learned from Malik's death. They distributed copies of their evidence to multiple secure locations. If anything happened to them, dozens of people were ready to release everything. It wasn't just about gathering evidence anymore, it was about staying alive long enough to use it. The most disturbing discovery came from a seemingly unrelated case. A young officer who'd reached out to them was found dead in an apparent suicide. But when Clara examined the details, she recognized the pattern. It matched other suicides from the past 5 years, all of officers who had started asking questions about Operation Clean Sweep. The community center meeting was supposed to be secure. Clara and Jamal had gathered key community leaders, whistleblowers, and activists to plan their next steps. Security teams checked the building twice. But someone had talked. The raid started with flashbangs and tear gas. SWAT teams burst through multiple entrances, weapons drawn. "This is a drug interdiction operation," they announced, though no one believed it. Clara recognized the tactics: This was about seizing their evidence and identifying their allies. Most attendees managed to escape through pre-planned routes, but Clara wasn't quick enough. She found herself slammed against a wall, handcuffed, and charged with obstruction of justice and interfering with a police investigation. As they led her out, she caught a glimpse of Assistant Director Thompson watching from across the street. In custody, Clara faced a barrage of interrogations. They kept her isolated, switching interrogators every few hours, trying to break her down. The questions revealed their fear. Where are the files? Who has copies? What did Malik tell you? But something felt off about her arrest. The officers were too careful, too conscious of procedure. They were building a legal case, which meant they were worried. Clara realized this wasn't just about silencing her, they needed to discredit everything she and Jamal had uncovered. Meanwhile, Jamal had escaped the raid with crucial evidence. From a safe house, he watched as the media reported Clara's arrest. The official story painted her as a rogue agent who had manipulated evidence to pursue a personal vendetta against the police. They claimed she had mental health issues, was paranoid, unstable. Then Jamal received an anonymous email. Check footage from Camera 23, Evidence Room B, March 15, 10:47 p.m. Attached was a keycard access code. Someone inside was still helping them. The footage showed something extraordinary. Officer Reynolds, one of the main suspects, meeting with Assistant Director Thompson in the evidence room. They were examining items from a major drug bust, but some packages disappeared after their visit. More importantly, the timestamp matched exactly when Malik had reported finding proof of FBI involvement. Jamal knew he had to move fast. Clara's arrest meant they were tying up loose ends. He began uploading encrypted copies of everything they had gathered to secure servers worldwide. If anything happened to him, Dead Man's switches would release it all. In her cell, Clara received an unexpected visitor, Officer Martinez's wife. They killed him, she whispered. My husband was going to talk. They staged it like a suicide, but... She slipped Clara a phone number before being led away. The number led to a burner phone hidden in Martinez's desk. On it, Clara found text messages suggesting that Operation Clean Sweep wasn't just about stealing and reselling drugs. The corruption extended to human trafficking, using seized evidence lockers to move people across state lines. Jamal was putting the pieces together when his safe house was compromised. Someone had tracked his digital footprint. As he fled across rooftops, he realized they had underestimated the resources aligned against them. This wasn't just corrupt cops, they were fighting against a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had infiltrated multiple levels of law enforcement. Clara's situation grew more desperate. Her lawyer was denied access. No charges were formally filed. She was being held in administrative detention, a legal black hole. Through the bars of her cell, she heard officers discussing plans to transfer her to a more secure facility. She knew what that meant. She'd disappear, just like others who'd gotten too close to the truth. The breaking point came during a massive protest outside the courthouse where Clara was being held. Jamal had orchestrated the moment perfectly. As thousands gathered, massive screens mounted on nearby buildings suddenly flickered to life. The evidence they'd gathered began playing for all to see. Surveillance footage showed corrupt officers moving drugs from evidence lockers. Bank statements revealed millions flowing through offshore accounts. Audio recordings captured deals being made, threats being issued. But most damning was Malik's final recording, made hours before his death, laying out the entire conspiracy. If you're seeing this, Malik's voice echoed across the square, I'm probably dead. But what I've uncovered can't die with me. The crowd fell silent as he detailed the corruption, named names, and exposed the entire network, including FBI Assistant Director Thompson's role. Inside her cell, Clara heard the commotion. Guards rushed out, leaving minimal security. She had prepared for this moment, using a lockpick she'd concealed during her arrest. Within minutes, she was moving through the building's service corridors, using her FBI training to avoid detection. Jamal, orchestrating the release from a secured location, watched as social media exploded. News networks picked up the feed. The footage was streaming worldwide. There was no containing it now. but he knew they would try. The police response was immediate and aggressive. Riot squads moved in to disperse the crowd. But this time was different. Too many cameras were rolling, too many people were watching. Every act of force was being broadcast live. Then came the countermove. Police chiefs from 3 cities were suddenly arrested by federal agents, not Thompson's people, but a separate task force that had been building its own case. The conspiracy was unraveling from multiple directions. Clara emerged from the courthouse to find the streets in chaos. Through the crowd, she spotted Thompson trying to escape in an unmarked car. She commandeered a motorcycle, leading to a high-speed chase through Manhattan streets. The pursuit ended at the docks where, cornered, Thompson revealed the final piece of the puzzle. "You think this ends with us?" he sneered. "This goes all the way to Congress. We're just the middle management." Before Clara could stop him, he reached for what appeared to be a weapon. Police snipers, positioned by the legitimate FBI task force, took him down. Back at the protest, the momentum had shifted. Police officers began lowering their weapons. Some even removed their riot gear and joined the protesters. The thin blue line was breaking, as honest cops finally felt empowered to stand against corruption. Jamal appeared on the courthouse steps, megaphone in hand. His voice carried over the crowd. "This isn't just about Malik anymore. This is about every officer who tried to speak up and was silenced. Every witness who disappeared. Every piece of evidence that vanished. Today, we take back our justice system." The screens continued to play evidence, including security footage showing the true circumstances of Malik's death. He had been executed, not accidentally shot. The officers involved had been following direct orders from Thompson. As federal agents swarmed police headquarters, computers were seized, files secured. Officers involved in the conspiracy began turning on each other, hoping for deals. The wall of silence crumbled as quickly as it had been built. The following weeks saw an unprecedented wave of investigations, arrests, and revelations. Federal courtrooms filled with cases as prosecutors worked overtime to process the evidence. Clara and Jamal found themselves at the center of the largest police corruption trial in American history. The courthouse became a fortress during the hearings. Security was handled by federal marshals, no local police allowed. Inside, Clara took the stand for 6 grueling days, methodically laying out the evidence. Her testimony connected every dot, from street-level corruption to the highest ranks of law enforcement. Malik Johnson didn't die because of a mistake, she testified. He died because he discovered that the very system meant to protect citizens had been turned into a criminal enterprise. The badge had become a shield for criminals in uniform. Jamal's reporting continued throughout the trials. His daily articles exposed new layers of corruption: judges who had been bought off, prosecutors who had buried evidence, politicians who had looked the other way. Each revelation brought more whistleblowers forward. The most dramatic moment came when Officer Torres, the evidence room clerk who had helped them, emerged from witness protection. Despite attempts on his life, he testified about years of evidence tampering. His detailed records provided the paper trail that prosecutors needed to secure convictions. But the fight for justice extended beyond the courtroom. Clara and Jamal worked with reform advocates to draft new legislation. They proposed independent oversight committees, stronger whistleblower protections, and mandatory body camera reforms. The movement they'd started was transforming into lasting institutional change. The human cost became clearer as victims of the corruption began speaking out. Families torn apart by false arrests. Lives ruined by planted evidence. Communities terrorized by badge-wearing criminals. Each story strengthened the case for systemic change. Professional consequences mounted. The police commissioner resigned in disgrace. Internal affairs departments in 3 cities were completely restructured. The FBI launched a comprehensive review of all operations overseen by Thompson's office. Clara faced her own battles within the bureau. Some colleagues viewed her as a traitor, others as a hero. But her actions had exposed serious flaws in federal oversight of local law enforcement. New protocols were being developed, inspired by Malik's meticulous documentation methods. Jamal's coverage earned him a Pulitzer nomination, but more importantly, it sparked a national conversation about police accountability. Other journalists began investigating their local departments, using his techniques as a template. The trials lasted months. Each day brought new revelations, new arrests, new guilty pleas. Officers who had participated in the conspiracy turned state's evidence, hoping for leniency. The blue wall of silence crumbled as former allies turned on each other. In the end, over 60 officers were convicted. 3 judges were disbarred. 2 prosecutors faced criminal charges. The investigation expanded to other cities, revealing similar patterns of corruption nationwide. But the real victory came in the form of reform. New laws were passed requiring independent investigations of police shootings. Civilian oversight boards were strengthened. Evidence handling procedures were completely overhauled. The bombshell dropped on the final day of the federal trial. A new witness requested to testify, former Deputy Police Commissioner William Chen, who had allegedly died in a car accident 6 months before Malik's death. His appearance in the courtroom caused an audible gasp. Chen revealed that Malik hadn't just stumbled upon a corruption ring, he had uncovered Operation Kingmaker, a decades-long conspiracy to control police departments across multiple cities. The goal wasn't just profit from drug sales and evidence theft, it was political power. The corruption you've exposed is just the surface, Chen testified. Operation Kingmaker was designed to place controlled officers in positions of power across the country. We could influence elections, control investigations, direct law enforcement resources wherever our sponsors needed them. The sponsors, as Chen revealed, included members of Congress, corporate executives, and even foreign interests. They had used the police departments as their private security force, ensuring their illegal operations remained protected while targeting their competitors. Malik had discovered this broader conspiracy through a seemingly unrelated human trafficking investigation. The evidence he collected wasn't just about corrupt cops, it exposed a shadow network that had infiltrated multiple levels of government. The revelation transformed the case from a police corruption scandal into one of the largest conspiracy investigations in American history. Federal agents raided offices across the country. Politicians suddenly announced early retirements. Corporate executives fled overseas. Clara and Jamal found themselves processing the true scope of what Malik had died to expose. His final recorded words took on new meaning, "This goes higher than anyone could imagine. The whole system needs to be rebuilt." The justice system responded with unprecedented force. Special prosecutors were appointed. Congressional hearings were convened. International law enforcement agencies joined the investigation as the conspiracy's global connections emerged. In a private moment during the chaos, Clara found a sealed letter in Malik's desk, his contingency plan. He had known the risks, had prepared for every possibility. His letter read, "If you're reading this, the truth is finally coming out. Remember, this was never about taking down a few corrupt cops. It was about giving the badge back its honor." The story ended with reform sweeping through law enforcement nationwide. New oversight systems were implemented. Training was overhauled. Community relations were prioritized. Malik's death had sparked a revolution in American policing. At the memorial service marking 1 year since Malik's death, Clara and Jamal stood with his family as a new police accountability center was dedicated in his name. His mother unveiled the plaque, in memory of Malik Johnson, who died protecting the true meaning of justice. But perhaps the most powerful moment came later, when a young recruit at the police academy asked to see Malik's final badge. Jamal, who had kept it safe all this time, watched as it was placed in a display case. Below it, a simple inscription read, "The price of truth is high, but the cost of silence is higher." The case had changed everything, not just policies and procedures, but the very culture of law enforcement. Malik's legacy lived on in every honest officer who found the courage to speak up, every citizen who demanded accountability, and every person who chose truth over silence. As Clara and Jamal left the ceremony, they knew their work wasn't finished. Somewhere, other Maliks were fighting similar battles. But now they had a roadmap, a precedent, and most importantly, hope. The system could be changed, but only if people were brave enough to risk everything for the truth. The end of this case marked the beginning of a new era in American justice, one built on transparency, accountability, and the unwavering courage of those who refuse to let corruption win.